Hello. So there's a way in which today is a day that comes with kind of mixed feelings for me. I can remember about 2 years ago in a conversation with the Prime Minister. This was before the elections had been called, but it was at a time when he already was inordinately aware of developments at NYU in a remarkable way. And I said to him, someday we're going to want you to be part of the NYU family. I hope it's 8 years from now. It didn't turn out that way. That brings me here knowing that the world and the UK and the United States are less well off because of that. But the silver lining is that today we get to make a very special announcement that the Prime Minister will be joining the NYU family, not just today, but in an ongoing project that will go out over the next years. It's an exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess in the formal sacramentalization of that, probably as I turn the microphone over to them, I'll have to give him a welcoming NYU hug. But this is something that he's grown willing to accept over the years. Let me just say a moment about what the project will be, because it's quite exciting. He will come to visit NYU at least 4 times a year over these next years, for about a week each time. Each fall and each spring, he'll come to NYU in New York. In either the fall or spring, he'll visit with the students and faculty and staff at NYU Abu Dhabi. And the 4th time he'll visit at one of the 16 campuses, including New York or Abu Dhabi, so one of the 14 other campuses somewhere around the world. We now have 16 NYU campuses on 6 continents. So he will be a presence within our community, literally throughout the world, but more importantly, he will be an intellectual presence with Bob Shrum, his dear friend and my dear friend. His dear friend for a relatively short period of a couple of decades. Bob and I realized that our friendship is about to get to its 50th anniversary, and is a friendship of brothers. But Bob Shrum, who of course is a faculty member at the Wagner School, Craig Calhoun, who is one of the stars of our university and a faculty member in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Katie Fleming, another NYU star who's now in Europe but will be coming home. The 3 of them, with the Prime Minister, will drive a conversation in each of his visits in open colloquia around the theme of global civil society and global virtue. And they will have an ongoing conversation featuring presenters each time in a serious, iterative thought process which will result in a written work product. And we're talking about people earlier today. We were on the phone talking with Anthony Appiah, for example, Jonathan Sachs from the UK, people of world-class stature in a conversation designed to advance this notion of global civil society, which is so important for the future of humankind. So welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. Delighted to have you here. Before I turn the microphone over to Bob, who will do the formal introduction, I just want to give a personal insight into this man. My wife, Lisa, and I, through Bob and his wife, Mary Louise Oates, who are dear friends of ours, we're fortunate enough to have Gordon and the Prime Minister and his wife Sarah brought into our lives about 12 years ago, I think. And it was a privileged view. It was a view that brought us first to number 11, then to number 10 Downing Street, and to Checkers, to go to Checkers if you're a little guy from Brooklyn, and to sit in a chair across from the Prime Minister, just the two of you, a chair where Winston Churchill sat, and have conversation about the things of the world is something you just never thought you'd be able to do. I want you to know that one of the most impressive things that's revealed in that kind of an inside view about this man is that he is a man of ideas, a man of the mind, and a man of the heart and of the soul. It was occasionally the case that I'd be in my office here in New York, 5:30, 6, 7 at night, and someone would come in and say, the Prime Minister's on the phone, and he, unlike there are many NYU people here, and I have a bulletin for you. Every now and then I write what I call reflections. They're 30, 40, 50-page papers on different parts of the university. Or the world. They're meant to be conversation starters. I'm telling you something you probably don't know, but I'll also add, he would have read them. He's probably the only person in the room, other than Bob, who actually has read my reflections. And he would call me up, and we would start, and I'd realize it was 5 or 6 hours difference in time. So for him, this was an end-of-the-day activity. But I would always learn from those conversations about what I had written. He would always advance my thought. He's an extraordinary, erudite, brilliant man. But he is first and foremost a man of the heart and the soul. And one of the indelible memories that I have was we were to have dinner, Lisa and I, with his family at number 11. We had come into town, and we'd gone out to number 11, and we got to number 11, and we rang the doorbell, and Sarah said, we have to wait. He was still Chancellor of the Exchequer. And ironically, given what's going on in the United States today, and given that he's here, there was a vote coming up on education. And the government was at risk. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer could not leave the chamber. And Sarah said, he'll be here soon, we'll have dinner. And then an hour went by, and we were having fun, the kids were running around. And it was, and the thing that struck me is a time came when he called and said, I'm not going to be able to leave, come down. And we walked out of that alley where number 10 is. Here, the wife and child, the young child in a stroller of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the 3 adults and 1 child walked through the streets with no security, down to Parliament, and then into Parliament. We didn't have to go through the machines, right into Parliament, and up, and to see his young son, who was so comfortable. It was like my Katie here in the law school when she was 4 and 5 and 6. And to see his face beaming, and to see the members as they would come up and play. And it was actually much more of a treat to see that side than it would have been to have dinner back at number 11. It is from the bottom of my heart that I say that I really am sad for the world. But I'm glad for NYU that this day has come. You will learn a little bit today, and then if you take the trouble to follow the development over the years to come, that today we welcome to NYU one of the great citizens of the world. I'm very, very proud to say, my friend, Prime Minister Gordon Brown.
I have known John for 50 years, actually 49, soon to be 50, I hope. And he's a person I treasure. And for me at least, and I think for a lot of people here, he's a treasure for this university. He's helped elevate it and define it in really profound ways. And his notion of the global network university is as compelling, I think, as Gordon Brown's vision of the global economy and global civil society. I've been privileged for almost 2 decades to be a friend of the person sitting next to me. I will tick off the obligatory facts. By the way, he was elected rector of Edinburgh University when he was 21 years old, while he was a student there. And usually it was someone like a prime minister, a former prime minister, and he ran and won because the students could vote. He is also a prolific writer. He was a decisive architect of New Labour and the comeback of the Labour Party in Britain after the Thatcher years. Was the longest serving Chancellor of the Exchequer in modern times, 10 years. Redid the architecture of financial management there, making the Bank of England independent so that interest rates were not set by politicians, was a dominant force in foreign policy, was the principal reason why, and they should probably put a statue up of him for this, the principal reason why Britain did not join the euro. And in 2008, as someone commented afterwards, all he did was save the world. Joseph Stiglitz, in a review of his new book, which we're going to talk about today, said it's a gripping book and a brilliant book, and it's about ideas and policies, and steers clear of the score settling of most political memoirs. And then he says, were it not for the strong Keynesian policies that Gordon Brown pushed around the world, the global downturn would have been much worse because we were at the risk of moving into a global depression. And if he had not pushed his alternative approach of equity injections rather than merely buying bad assets from the banks, our entire financial system would be in much worse shape. He is not just a politician, this is Stiglitz, but a thinker who has pointed the way forward for the world. He's also an absolutely extraordinary person. I have been blessed in my life by being able to work with political leaders. There are 2 of them who are giants in terms of, yes, friendship, but even more a deep, profound respect that I have for them and their capacity to move and change the world for the better. And one was my friend Senator Ted Kennedy, and the other is my friend Gordon Brown, who is going to start off by saying a few words, and then I'll ask a couple of questions, and then you guys can ask questions.
Thank you very much. Can I say I am here for one very, very important reason, because your brilliant president, John Sexton, has inspired me, as he inspires you, and as he inspires increasingly many continents around the world, with a vision of a global network university. This is a vision that is born out of John's great and deep thinking. It's a vision that is forged out of a view of the interdependence of civilizations around the world. It is a view that is being driven forward by brilliant people in this university. And it's being realized in a campus already in Abu Dhabi, plans for other campuses, plans for sites in all the different continents of the world, with this great ideal that by people meeting each other, discussing with each other, debating with each other, ideas and challenging each other about their ideas and prejudices, that we can build a stronger global society in the future. So I am very privileged to have been invited, first of all, by my great friend Bob Schramm, and then by John Sexton, to be a small part in a great project, which is one of the path-breaking initiatives that is going to change our world for good over the next few years. And I believe that you, who are students and supporters and friends of New York University, are indeed privileged to be part of a project that is going to change not just your country, but change the whole world. I started off as a lecturer in a university when I was somewhat younger. And universities, as you know, stand for objectivity, for rationality, for impartiality, for the disinterested pursuit of truth. And these are all the qualities you have to leave behind when you go into politics, as I found out. I've had a bit of time on my hands, as John has explained, over these last few months, involuntarily. And I looked at what my predecessors had done and had achieved. When Disraeli, who was a great prime minister in Britain of the 19th century, left office, he started writing poetry. And the fact that nobody was interested in reading it or even hearing it didn't seem to worry him at all. When Gladstone, who was another great prime minister of the 19th century, left office, he ran, and it was commented on at the time, but just imagine what the papers would have made of it now, the media now. He ran what he called the Midnight Club for Fallen Women. And he used to go out into the streets of London to try to rescue prostitutes. And it raised people to question what his real motives were. And then we had a great prime minister in Lloyd George, who's probably the only prime minister of Britain that has ever made the pages of Playboy because of his own behaviour. Churchill resigned in 1955, and he changed his resolution he had made, Winston Churchill, never to drink before lunchtime. And when he retired, he changed it, that he would never drink alcohol before breakfast. And we had a prime minister called Rosebery, who whenever a horse race meeting, clashed with the cabinet meeting, which is the biggest event of the political calendar, he always chose to go to the race meeting. But when he retired, he said the greatest thing that had happened in his life was nothing to do with politics. It was his horse winning the greatest racing competition that took place in Britain, the Grand National. So I decided I would do something far more productive. I would work with New York University. So I'm very privileged to be here today. When I was chairman of the International Monetary Fund, and we had meetings in Washington, and this is what I want to speak about very briefly before we have you free to ask any questions you want of me and to continue that discussion. We had a meeting a few years ago, and there were demonstrators outside the meeting, and they were complaining about globalization and all the effects of it. And I looked around the posters that were being displayed at that rally, and there were all sorts of different groups represented. But was one poster that stood out, and someone had put on their lettering, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And you understand what people meant. In France, they had an anti-globalization campaign, which was very simple, and it said no to 2009. That was in 2008. A completely nihilist approach. But I want to say that what has been happening over the last few years, and what is likely to happen over the last few years, raises profound questions about the global economy, our global society, and our role as citizens for the future. And in any great city, and this is the greatest city of America, New York, in any great city, these are profound questions that we've got to think about. The good news and bad news is about globalization is this. The difficult news for America and for Europe to accept is that for the first time in 200 years of industrial history, for the first time even going through wars and depressions and wars again, we have now reached a position where for the first time, Europe and America together are being outproduced by the rest of the world, particularly Asia, out-manufactured, out-exported, out-invested by these countries. And it was hardly surprising that at some point, Europe and America, 10% of the world's population, would stop being the continents that would produce more than 50% of the world's goods and 50% of the world's manufactures and 50% of the world's exports. And if you've thought of that as the single fact of our generation, this massive change, this restructuring of the world economy that's taking place, you would probably be worried about the security of your job and the security of your children and the security of your savings and your investments for the future, because we're seeing a massive shift in the industrial productive potential of different parts of the world. But there's a second change that's working its way through and is really going to be seen over the next few years as perhaps the most powerful driver of world economic growth. Because the billion people who are producers in Asia, in China and India, but also in the emerging market countries of Brazil and Russia and South Africa and so on, they are not going to be content with being producers. They want to be consumers as well. So the biggest driving force of the next 10 years will be the rise of the middle classes in all the different countries and continents that we call emerging markets at the moment. And this is the huge opportunity for the world economy to grow again. This is the exit strategy from the current set of financial crises that we've got. This is the opportunity for American ingenuity and dynamism and innovation to show that it can produce goods, high technology goods, custom-built goods, sophisticated goods, knowledge-based goods that are going to not only sweep the markets of America and Europe, but sweep those huge new consumer markets of the future. So the world economy can rebalance. The world economy can create jobs. The world economy can create growth in the future. The world economy can transcend a financial crisis that had been very deep indeed, and this massive structural change that is happening between Europe, America, Asia, and the rest of the world. But to do that, you cannot pursue orthodox policies because you're at a point of transition in the world economy. You cannot afford not to invest in education and training and skills and technology and science. If you do so, you will not have the goods and the services that will be the most sophisticated and the ones that people want to buy. And America, with its great inventive genius and with its great ability to create companies that can sell to the world, can be one of the great beneficiaries of this new era. Because you're creating a consumer market in Asia that's twice the size of the consumer market in America. And the second thing that's going to happen is that if we trade freely with other countries and don't become protectionist, then we can get the big shares of these markets. But there's a danger of protectionist sentiment at the moment, people saying, we've got a problem here because we've got imports coming from other countries. Think of it the other way around. We've got an opportunity here because we've got a huge export market that free trade can allow us to benefit from in the future. And the third thing that's got to happen in the future, if we're going to make the most of these new opportunities that are unheard of since the Industrial Revolution, is there's got to be global cooperation. If countries don't work together, then we will find that the world will grow more slowly, and more people will be unemployed, and more people will have lower standards of living than is possible than if we worked together. And I think the biggest test of the next few years is whether America and Europe and Africa and Asia can work together in cooperation to build economic policies that mean that you have sustained growth and, because of environmental improvements, sustainable growth, and you can create jobs. And I've estimated you could create 50 million extra jobs, and this would help America escape this period of unemployment if we had coordinated policies across the world. So the message I have from my experience and learning from what we had to do to counteract the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 is that there are global problems and they need global solutions. You can't have financial stability in America if there's financial instability in every other country. You can't have good environmental policies in America that work if they're going to be undermined by bad environmental policies elsewhere. And you can't have growth without trade, and that means that you have to cooperate with other countries to do so. This week is the week of the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded, controversially, as you know, to a Chinese citizen. But some of you may have heard the story of Alfred Nobel, who was the founder of the Nobel Prize. He woke up one morning while on holiday in France, he was a Swede, and he saw a newspaper that had wrongly an obituary of him, even although he was perfectly alive. And he got a terrible shock because the obituary said of Alfred Nobel, and it was a mistake because it was his brother who had actually lost his life. The obituary said that this was one of the most notorious and infamous men who was responsible for more deaths than almost any other because he was a manufacturer of armaments and he had sold them with impunity to the whole of the world and allowed armies to fight each other with his weapons. And Nobel was so impressed by this criticism of him that he decided to change his life, and hence the Nobel Peace Prize, hence the Nobel Prizes for science and physics and mathematics and economics, hence his intention to do something good in the last few years of his life that he thought would undo some of the damage he'd done in the earlier years of his life. And it does strike me that the world can change. Like Nobel changed, the world can change, and we can actually do things better in the future. One of the great things I've been asked to do in the last few weeks, it's 50 years this year since John F. Kennedy won the presidency of the United States of America. It is 50 years in January since he gave that famous inauguration address that many of you will have read and absorbed and been inspired by, as I was and as many other people were. And in that inauguration address, there are many, many great phrases and sentiments and invocations to do good. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Never negotiate from fear, never fear to negotiate. The torch has passed to a new generation. In fact, Richard Nixon was asked, because he was his opponent in the presidential election, which of these lines he would love to have given himself if he had been the president, and he replied, yeah, the line I would have preferred was, I hereby accept the office of President of the United States of America. But I was asked by people who are compiling for the Kennedy Library if I would read some of the words from this inaugural address. And they've asked people from every continent of the world, from India and from China and from America, Latin America, from Europe, to read a section of that great inaugural address. And they've compiled this as a list of international speakers reading out this address in a new way for a new age. And the part that I was asked to read was, divided, we will certainly fail. United, however, we can work together to abolish the great evils of our time: hunger, illiteracy, poverty, conflict, and war. And I think these are the sentiments that should influence us as we move forward. We've just seen a great global crisis. It has ruined the lives of large numbers of people avoidably. We can build a better global economy in the future, and I'm suggesting one of the ways that we can go about this. But we can underpin that global economy by an ethical view of how different continents can work together and share ideas and benefit from each other's faith traditions. There is nowhere better to start learning the lessons about the past so that we can influence the future than this great university, which, to the credit of your president, is now leading the first global network university of our time, the first in our history, and one that is certainly going to change the world for good. Thank you for the opportunity to address you.
It was a great crisis, and Gordon Brown has written a great book about it called Beyond the Crash, the First Crisis of Globalization, in which he touches on in depth many of the themes he just sounded. I'm going to, in the interest of letting people in the audience be part of this, I'm going to ask one question, then we're going to open it up to you, all of you. One of the most gripping scenes in the book is, and you powerfully convey it, is what you did on your flight back from America on September 26, 2008, as the world teetered on the brink of financial collapse. You just left a meeting in the White House. On board that plane, typically you weren't sleeping, wielding the black pen, the black felt pen that you use. You wrote a phrase on a piece of yellow legal paper, and then on a second piece of yellow legal paper wrote another phrase. And those two phrases played a decisive role in rescuing the world from what could have been a relentless downward spiral. Do you mind telling the story and telling how you got the Americans to come around?
You know, it was fascinating what was happening at that time, but it was also frightening. If you think back to that period when Lehman Brothers had collapsed and the markets had frozen and nobody quite knew which was the next institution that was going to fall, and nobody quite knew how we were going to get out of this. And people were sort of grappling around for solutions because they didn't quite yet understand how serious the crisis was. And we had tried just about everything, and so had the Americans. We'd tried to provide liquidity or short-term finance to the banks on the grounds that this was simply a cash flow problem, if you like, if I put it in sort of ordinary parlance, rather than a structural problem. We'd try to give the banks money. Then we'd try to persuade the banks that they should get extra capital through rights issues. So they'd been issuing shares and trying to get people to buy them, and they had been incredibly unsuccessful. And all the time we were getting nearer the point at which banks would not be able to hand over cash to their customers because they just did not have the money coming in the way that was necessary, despite the fact that the Fed and the Bank of England and the European Central Bank were providing resources to them for a short period of time. And I sensed that the problem was not short-term finance, and I sensed that the problem couldn't be solved in an ordinary way. And I had had people working over the last few weeks before then about what was the real position of the banks, what was the true position, because they had all these diseased assets. They'd bet on property that was really going down in value so quickly. Companies were collapsing, and therefore the whole value of these companies were locked in their balance sheets. And I realized that we had a situation where we had the opposite of what we really thought the system was about. We had capitalism without capital. The banks did not have enough capital. And one banker said to me, you know, I'm only beginning to understand the risks I've been taking. And I thought, that's a bit late. And another one said to me, all I need is overnight finance. And the next day, his bank was collapsing. And he needed billions of pounds of capital to underpin his institution. So I talked to George Bush in the White House, and I talked to a lot of bankers in Wall Street, and I talked to all the other presidents and prime ministers who were here in New York for the United Nations meeting. And we couldn't get a consensus because nobody quite knew how bad the problem was. I realized we had two banks, actually three banks, that would have collapsed within a few days if we'd not acted. So as I was coming back in the plane, I sort of realized we, the government, have got to recapitalize these banks. We have got to buy shares in these banks. We have effectively got to semi-nationalize these banks, otherwise they'll not be able to keep going. If we didn't put capital in, nobody else would. And they couldn't survive just with short-term funding because they've been unable very soon to pay out money to people who were calling on the banks to do the service for them. So as I was coming back in the plane, I was working with people like Shruti Vadera, who was one of the great advisors we had, not sleeping, which I would rather have done in a flight back from the United States. And we said, recapitalize now. So I wrote that on this pad. We've got to restructure the banks immediately. And we were going to put up, and we decided, about $50 billion, pounds, which is, about 60, 70, $80 billion. And we decided we'd have to do that. And then I said, how could we persuade the banks that they would dilute their shareholdings, even when they were in such a grave position, but they were not admitting the gravity of the position? So we would have to say to them, under no circumstances would they get any more support from the government in funding or liquidity unless they agreed to our proposals. So we would have to give them an ultimatum. Either you agree to our proposals or we will stop funding you. So it wasn't as good as no taxation without representation, but it was no recapitalization no liquidity without recapitalization, and not very elegant, but that's what we had to do. And so in the next few days, we tried to persuade the rest of Europe, and we tried to persuade the Americans that this was the way forward. America was doing TARP at that time, you know,
Buying up all the troubled assets?
Troubled assets, yeah, buying up the diseased assets. And we thought that wasn't going to solve the problem. But gradually, people started to realize that this was the only way forward. We made an announcement. Nobody else was going to follow immediately. But by the weekend, the Europeans had invited me to their meeting so that they agreed to do it. And by Tuesday, the Americans had agreed that they would recapitalize their banks as well. And so we managed to avert what would have been, I think, a situation in a few days from then, where you couldn't have probably got your money from a cash point. And certainly businesses wouldn't have been able to pay their employees because the banks would have been unable to meet the commitments that they had. It was a real crisis. And I think it's only by understanding the depth and severity of the crisis that you can also understand the difficulties that President Obama and others have had in trying to get out of that crisis. It was so severe and so fundamental. If the markets froze up completely, then you've got a long way back from a situation that was so desperate and so severe. So we restructured the banks, and then we decided that we would approach all the other countries to do that, and then we decided you've got to refloat the world economy. So you've got to have resources in the world economy so it can start to grow again. And then we moved towards what was the April 2009 meeting, where we had the G20 set up for the first time, all the big countries, and they agreed to underpin the world economy by $1 trillion of resources. Never done before, never tried before, but I think the combined decisions of all these countries, America, Europe, and China and India being part of this as well, meant that we avoided what could have been a Great Depression. We certainly have had a great and terrible recession, but it didn't descend into the Great Depression that we've had in the 1930s. Now, we've got a lot of lessons to learn from that, and I try in the book to say we've got to build a global financial system that works, but we've also got to get back to growth pretty quickly, because you can't talk about an economic policy that's working if you've got 10% of your citizens unemployed. It's just not something that any civilized society wants to tolerate if it can do something about it. And these are avoidable redundancies that we've got to do something about.
Okay, if there are microphones in the aisles, if people could just line up there. There's one up there. Yes, sir.
Hi. Two short questions. First is, I wonder if you could compare the quality of the American financial reform to the quality of financial reforms in the UK and other places. Do you think what we did in this country after the recession was adequate to prevent another dip? And the second question is less about economic policy than it is about another part of global civil society, and that's information. I wonder if you could say something about diplomacy and security leaks and security after WikiLeaks and the Julian Assange situation. What kinds of policies do we need to develop to deal with situations like this?
Yeah, it's quite difficult to talk about secret diplomacy now, isn't it? It's one of these terms that people will talk about with a bit more caution in future. Can I say, first of all, on financial reform, that what I feel is missing at the moment is that we do things in a coordinated way. I think one of the problems that caused the financial crisis was if you have one financial center like New York or London that could be doing all the right things, it can easily be undermined by another financial center that is in a race to the bottom in standards. And so there's no doubt that a lot of the problems arose in New York and in London, but there's also no doubt that a shadow banking system developed which was being operated from a whole series of regulatory and tax havens. And if you have that race to the bottom in standards where people can move the money from a place that is got regulations and rules that make sense to a place that is lax and is really competing for business on the basis of the laxity of its standards, then you've got a problem. So my plea would be, if we are setting rules and regulations for the future, that America and Europe and the major financial centers of the world that now include Hong Kong and Singapore, as well as the European and American centers, that we coordinate our rules and regulations and standards in such a way and in a transparent way that we don't have this race to the bottom that we saw in the past. Because I certainly found with British institutions that to follow the money, you had to go to almost every part of the world and ended up in tax havens and regulatory havens that really were, if you like, lowering the standard that we've got to expect if we are going to have proper financial stability for the future. So the lesson is not whether America and Britain are doing the right or wrong things. I think they're trying to do the right things at the moment. The lesson is if you don't coordinate it, then some other regime will offer itself as a lax regime and cause further problems in the future. As far as diplomacy is concerned, you know, there's nothing that has come out of these tapes that suggests that in most cases America is not pursuing an honest and principled foreign policy. There are certain parts of them that you would question. There's certain parts that nobody will like. There's certain decisions that look quite strange to some people. But generally speaking, what we've seen is an America that is trying to play an honourable role in the world. And trying to do its best. It's of course the implementation of these sentiments that becomes the issue in so many different parts of the world, where you're working for peace in the Middle East, where you're working to get your troops out of Afghanistan, but you have a stable Afghanistan, where you're working to make sure that Pakistan is free of terrorism, where you're working to see less nuclear proliferation. Now, these are the aims of President Obama's policy, and I don't think there's much that I've seen in the disclosure of the emails and everything else that suggests that that is anything other than the wish of the Americans to achieve. But obviously there are embarrassments for me and for other people in some of the things that are said, and you've just got to accept that.
Sir.
Hi, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Fang Zhou, and I come from China. And it's really a great honor for me to have a chance to ask you the question. And as you know, as an emerging market with great potential, Chinese economy is growing really fast. So my question is, how will you comment on China's role on the China's role on the road of recovery, and how will you comment your personal experience with a Chinese leader and China? Thank you.
I don't think there's any country that did more to stimulate its economy to keep the world economy as a whole moving forward than China. And if you actually look at the figures, the amount of extra construction, the amount of extra investment, the amount of extra stimulus in the economy was greater in China than in almost any other country in the world. And China has had the capacity over these last 30 years to take 400 million people out of poverty. And that is a great achievement that I know from talking to President Hu and Premier Wen that they are rightly proud of. Now, we can have our disagreements with China about human rights and about the freedom of the press. But we must also seek agreements with China about the future. But my argument in the book is that if China, India, Asia, America, and Europe in particular, but with Africa and Latin America as well, coordinated our policies, if China was able to raise its consumption of goods and services, so you would be able to take more people out of poverty more quickly, be able to grow your middle class in a faster way than previously planned. And if at the same time Indonesia and Japan and other Asian countries were able to do likewise, then you would have such a boost to demand in the world economy that the American and the European economies would be able to move forward as well, because they would be able to export goods to the rest of the world. And I just say that the biggest single change you will see in the next 10 years, and we've already seen massive change through the productivity of the Chinese worker and through the Asian growth we've seen in the last 10 years. But the biggest change you will see in the next 10 years is this billion more middle-class consumers wanting to buy goods, including the branded goods, the technology-driven goods that we produce here in America and in Europe. And that will be the biggest boost for the world economy that could happen. And that will create thousands of jobs here in America, because we are in a position to export, as is Britain and Europe, to the rest of the world. So China is absolutely vital to the future of the world economy, not just because of what it can do for itself, but because what in combination and in concert the rest of the world can do to boost world growth and world jobs. So we need more dialogue. We need more discussion. I believe that the best thing that could happen to push growth forward in the next year or two is China agreed to consume more, America invested more in its education and its technology for the future, Europe tackled its unemployment, and of course we got Africa and the different continents of the world growing again. Now, a global agreement could make that possible, and I don't think we're so far away from getting that idea onto the agenda so that at the next G20, that is part of the major discussion. So you can see how important I think China's role in the future is and is going to be.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Daniel J. Dell. I'm a senior at the Stern School of Business, the undergraduate business school at NYU, and I had the terrific privilege to study for my freshman year in London at Bedford Square. I hope you'll be able to drop by it at some point soon.
Of
if
course.
you haven't already. It's number 6.
Look, we need economists in Britain now to give us advice, so could you come back and help us?
I'd love to come back with you. And I saw you last night on The Daily Show, and I know you mentioned markets need morals. I couldn't agree more. I'm studying ethics now for part of my senior research, and I'd like to know from you what ethical principles drive you, and if you'd have any advice for a 21-year-old such as myself who holds a moral compass and hopes to be able to continue to hold it and live by it as I enter the workforce.
Well, that's a brilliant question, and I do wish you well. And I'm not joking when I say we need economists in Britain at the moment, so think about coming to work in our country as well for a bit of time. You know, it's a central question of political economy. What is the morality that has got to underpin a successful marketplace? And you know, the study of economics is changing quite fast now, because in the 80s we were talking about the efficient markets model. Now people are talking about behavioral economics to try to explain why people don't always act rationally, and why fairness, why, if you like, fear, why irrational exuberance sometimes dominates the behavior that you see in the marketplace. And I think we're going back to the study of political economy. And I think that will be something that any economics student will want to play their part in examining in future years. And as I understand political economy, it started with Adam Smith, who happened to be a citizen of the town in which I grew up, and I'm now the Member of Parliament for serving in the House of Commons. And Adam Smith lived in this town and was born there and grew up there, and it has a 2-mile esplanade which looks like, and can you hear me? Yeah. And this 2-mile esplanade, he would look out every morning and he would see ships coming in and out of Kirkcaldy that were trading with the rest of Europe, and this was the middle of the 18th century. And because he saw this trading taking place, he then thought, well, trade is the engine of growth. And then he realized that to trade you had to specialize, and to specialize you had to have a proper division of labor between those who did certain tasks and those who did others. And his whole theory of how the economy worked was built from this idea that looking out on the sea, he could see that trade was actually transforming the whole economic landscape in the town in which he was born. But Adam Smith thought that the theory of moral sentiments, which was the book that he also wrote, was far more important than that book on trade, The Wealth of Nations. And he always said this was the most important thing that he was trying to contribute to the study of society. And underpinning the economy and underpinning markets, there had, in his view, to be values that people held to be important. And of course you value enterprise and you value competition and you value the entrepreneurship that is absolutely vital to the success of an economy. But Adam Smith also said that you've got to value fairness and responsibility and the values that we think important in our everyday life. You don't admire people who are friends of yours who don't show integrity, or you can't trust, and are not responsible, and don't do their duty, and live off the backs of other people rather than help contribute to the common good. And in the same way, he said that the economy, and we would now say big multinational companies and finance companies, if they don't exhibit these values, then there is a danger that we will have, as we had 2 or 3 years ago, markets that don't self-regulate, but markets that self-destruct. So I would say that the values that he wrote about in the 18th century are still the values that have got to guide our economy. And I think the 20th century was a battle between markets and states. What power should markets have? What power should governments have? And you had one side saying that markets ruled and the other side saying that the state ought to be far more important. In the 21st century, I think people will say that markets and states can both become vested interests. They can both take power at the expense of the ordinary citizen and the public interest. And to control and temper and to supervise the operation of governments and markets, they have got to be visibly underpinned by clear ethical values. And you've got to test how markets are working and how governments are working according to these values. Are they acting responsibly? Is there integrity? Can they be trusted? Are they operating in a fair manner? And I think these are the values you've got to look for in a company and in a country's way of operating, as well as the values that you admire in the families and the neighborhoods where you live. And that's the case, I think, for political economy becoming more important in the study of economics in future. And that's why I would urge everybody who is thinking of a career in economics and business and finance to read some of the great works of political economy, which show that an economy can sustainably prosper only when there is trust, integrity, responsibility, and where people accept that in response to them being allowed to do everything that they want to do with their enterprise and in a competitive environment, they have got to exercise responsibility and not be reckless in their risk-taking at the expense of others. So these are the values that I think are age-old, but the values that come out of our experience of learning lessons from the crisis.
Thank you. You have my vote.
I wish we could stay for another whole hour because this is terrific, but we have time for maybe 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Hello, Prime Minister. My name is Jasper, and I'm also from China. So I have Also, one question regarding China. What specific suggestions or advice do you have for China to boost its consumption, which you said is very important, significant job for China to do, and to adjust itself in the mega trend of globalization? That's my question. Thank you.
Some of you may know that the amount of the national income consumed in America, so consumption as a share of national income in America, is something like 70%. The amount of consumption in China as a share of national income is about 35%. So China is producing a great deal, but only a third of what it's producing is being consumed by its own citizens. And that's where China can do more to help itself and to help the world economy. You know, in the 19th century, Britain and America, which were among the first countries to industrialize, Germany and France, not one of these countries committed themselves during the period of industrialization to the reduction or abolition of poverty. They may have thought that they might be able to do something about it with welfare programs, but they were never explicitly committed to the abolition or to the mass reduction of poverty. China is, India is, African countries are, and that's to the great credit of these countries that that is the commitment. So what have they got to do? They've got to create a safety net so that people have health provision. They've got to create a safety net so that if people are unemployed, they have some form of income. They've got to create a safety net so that people who are retired and elderly have some sort of provision for their retirement. And if these things can happen, and at the same time people are in a position to use some of the savings to buy homes, and in a position with higher wages to buy the goods that they want to buy, including consumer goods that we take for granted in this country, then China's path to being a middle-class country with large numbers of people owning their own homes and at the same time in a position to buy consumer goods would help not just Chinese people, but help the rest of the world. Because instead of America consuming more and Europe consuming more, then China would also be consuming a great deal, and the demand and supply in the world would be in balance, which is not in at the moment. So I think the Chinese government understand this and want to do more to improve the rural safety net, want to do more to help people who are going into the towns to get jobs, want to take more people out of poverty. But if we were to advance that more quickly in the next year or two, and if we had an international agreement which China felt comfortable about, because that was part of the agreement that different countries would do certain things, this would take the heat out of the currency wars, it would take the heat out of the balance of payments, which is the latest issue that was discussed at the G20. It would be China doing what it wanted to do, but doing it a bit more quickly than perhaps it planned to do, and it would be boosting consumer demand and exports and boosting production right around the world. So China can play a major part in rebalancing the world economy, but also in getting growth in America and Europe. And I think the pattern of events over the next 10 years are clear that China's got to consume more. If we could move that a bit faster, then a lot of the unemployment that we're likely to see in the next few years could be avoided.
Unfortunately, we have time for just one more brief question. Go ahead. I'm sorry, everyone.
So it's my answers that are too long. I
No.
apologize.
Hi, I'm Maha Attal. I'm a reporter with Forbes, and I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on the fallout of the crisis that's developing in Europe. I'm wondering if you think that the mechanisms that are currently in place, both the current fund and the plan for new mechanisms after 2013, are going to be sufficient to contain the crisis as it's developing in Portugal, Spain, other countries, or if not, are there other mechanisms that you would recommend?
You know, for those people who are not involved in these European issues, let me just say that the euro is the single currency. Its introduction was very, very controversial. Britain was one of the countries, and I was partly responsible for that, who decided not to join the euro because we thought it was difficult to manage. And at the same time, there's a huge amount of Euroscepticism. In other words, people skeptical about whether the euro can work in the long run. In fact, there's a lot of Euroscepticism in Britain as well, and there was one Eurosceptic being interviewed on BBC, which many of you will know about, the news programme, and he was being asked why he was so skeptical and so hostile and so anti the euro, and why he was against anything that was European. And the interviewer eventually, out of frustration because he wasn't giving a right answer, said, "Well, why are you so against it? Is it ignorance or is it apathy?" And the man replied, "I don't know and I don't care." and the euro the euro at the moment is undergoing difficult times because Greece has got a financial problem. It finds it difficult to get tax revenues in, and it's got a big public sector. Spain has got a different problem. Spain has got banks that really were over-lending, particularly in the property sector, something that happened in America and particularly also in Ireland as well, which has got a huge problem because it overbuilt property and it's got huge bank debts as a result of them lending money to property developers who can never pay that money back. And you've got Portugal, which has got a lot of private debt that is owed to people outside the country of Portugal itself. And people are then asking, well, if you've got all these problems in the euro and you've got to have all this help for these individual countries, can the euro itself survive? I think it's got to survive, even though I did not want Britain to join the euro. I think once you've made a big decision like creating a single currency, you've got to make it work. And there's three things that can be done to make it work. You've got to bring together the three difficult issues, the fiscal deficits, the bank liabilities I've just talked about, and the inability to grow. And if Europe can only solve its fiscal deficits but not grow, you're going to have massive unemployment. If it can not solve its bank liabilities and fails to do so, then you've got big problems ahead because banks will not be lending money to businesses and you'll have low growth anyway. So you've got to have a meeting of the Euro leaders. They get together. They've got to look at these three problems. They've got to find a way forward in one fell swoop for dealing with these problems. I've got ideas about how you might do this, but it's important that they do this in private. And then they've got to seize the initiative from the markets because countries are being picked off one by one. So you hear about Greece a few months ago, then Ireland a few weeks ago, and then Portugal today, and then Spain next. And you've got to seize the initiative from the markets. And one of the lessons we learned in 2009, when we had the threat of a world depression, was if governments don't act together and lead rather than are led by the markets, then you will get into huge problems and a downward cycle, a downward spiral that you can't get out of. So my recommendation is that the Euro group get together to deal with these three problems, which are all soluble, but have got to be dealt with together. Otherwise, you will have continued crises in the Euro area. So my recipe for the future is greater cooperation within the Euro area to deal with what are real problems that arise from the failure of the banks, as well as some problems associated with the return of economic growth. But we've got to avoid, in America as well, 10% unemployment in a Euro area, 10%, 9.8% unemployment in America. This calls for urgent international action for all of us to work together because we're all faced with similar problems where the resources of our economy, the people themselves, are being denied the chance to realize the potential in the workplace. And what is the purpose of economic policy if it does not include getting people into work so that they can be prosperous by their own efforts and not to have to rely on either social security or charity? Surely the important element of the next stage is getting more people back to work and giving young people the sense that they will have opportunities in the future.
Three quick announcements. First, in a few minutes, the Prime Minister will be signing books in the Greenberg Lounge across the hall. Could all of you remain in your places till he's left? Secondly, I want to thank all of you for coming. This has been a fascinating discussion, the beginning of something very important that Gordon Brown will lead here at NYU and around the world at NYU. And finally, on your behalf, and he quoted this person earlier, let me thank someone who, more than almost anyone, maybe more than anyone I've ever met, exemplifies President Kennedy's insight that leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. The world has benefited from Gordon Brown's leadership, and the world has a lot to learn from him, and so do we here at this university. Thank you very much.
Thank you.